Hi, Pamela. This is Ira, and I'm recording here my audio feedback on your statement of belief, which I hope will be helpful as you're making your final revisions to the Defining Good Argument in Digital Context essay, the major essay for the course. Essentially, what I'm going to do here is just go read back through your essay here and offer thoughts and responses to a couple different moments. And I want to note a couple of things you're doing that I think are really cool and successful, and also a couple of places where I want to challenge you or encourage you to think further. The goal of that is not to say you should have done something different in the statement of belief. Of course, that was perfectly fine. It was a good version of what it was. It's rather, my hope is that these thoughts will be useful as you move towards completion of the major essay. Okay, so obviously I can relate quite well with this sense of argument as ubiquitous or sort of written into all of our activities, and I think one of the things that you highlight here, that's the thing we often don't think about, but is I think actually really important, is internal arguments. That a lot of choosing is based on internal sort of self-argument. And I would have loved to hear you talk a little bit more about that and how that's related with external arguments. Are the arguments that we make to ourselves, are there common features between those and the arguments that we have with others? And if so, what are those common features? And if not, why not? When you say arguments should be used to persuade, and in order to persuade, one must understand their audience and operate through mutual respect when appropriate, I'd be interested to hear more about how that kind of plays out in your thinking about internal arguments. Then here I just had a couple questions. So when you say I'm a logical person, I try to be realistic. I think things through thoroughly. I go through possible outcomes, etc. Obviously I have no problem with those things, but I'd want to hear you talk more about what to you counts as logical, what to you counts as realistic. And the reason I think that's important here is because part of what's at stake in thinking about what you're going to count as good argument, or the kind of argument that you also wish others would make, is going to hinge on what kinds of things you count as logical and realistic and why. And working that through theoretically is also going to hinge on explaining why those things matter. Why should other people also value being logical, being realistic, being empathetic maybe, feeling things with conviction, etc.? How do all of these things, which are true pieces of who you are, how do they play out in how you think other people in general should argue in digital contexts? And so when you say you personally tend to be persuaded by logic, reasoning, and a smidge of emotional manipulation, and you go on to talk about that a little bit more, I'd want to hear you say, so okay, good. So what is logic here? What makes logic persuasive? What is reasoning? What makes reasoning reasoning? And what does reason consist? And I know I'm not asking you to write a dissertation on that, but to just kind of fill out the picture a little bit more. Why do those things matter? Why do they make things persuasive to you? Obviously, there are lots and lots of arguments that are persuasive to people that are probably almost all emotional manipulation and very little of other things. And so why for you is this combination better? What's the value of that? Before, initially, you kind of talk about, you suggest that arguments should be used to persuade. Okay, but you can be persuasive without these things, and indeed many people are, probably unfortunately, but what makes that unfortunate? In other words, if arguments are for persuading, but persuading doesn't always happen through logic and reasoning, and in fact sometimes is more effective without them, why should we still value them? Why are they still an important part of good argument as you see it? And that goes into thinking maybe about audience understanding, right? And I think you're making an important point that we make arguments that are most effective when they're well targeted to their audiences. But when you talk about Trump's unpersuasiveness to certain audiences, I mean, I think you're, of course, totally right, but he's also very persuasive to his quote unquote base, to a certain kind of audience that he attracts. And so if you think that that's okay or good, how do you wrap that together with your way of thinking about being logical and realistic and so on and so forth? Having strong logic and strong reasoning, since obviously those are not big parts of how he argues. So in other words, so if you think that how he argues is okay or reasonable or good, then how do you square that with your own definition of good argument? Conversely, if you think that what he does is bad or problematic, then what do you do with the fact that it is in fact very persuasive for his particular audiences? How do you kind of address that tension? And I think that same question is really at stake when you're talking about how people often argue online. So people are often rude, nasty, insulting, etc. And certainly, interpersonally between the people arguing, that's often not very persuasive to the person who's receiving the rudeness, nastiness, etc. But since online arguments often have some other audience, in other words, one makes an argument to an interlocutor, an argument partner, but one has some other set of readers in mind, and those readers, in fact, are often persuaded by this. So why is that bad? And again, I want to be clear. I'm not saying I think it's good. I'm saying for your theoretical statement of good argument, it's important for you to think, if you don't think that that's good, for you to explain why not. Since, after all, it is sometimes persuasive. It seems like there's a kind of a tension or a conflict here between what is ethical or what is effective. And so when you say at the end of the day, calling people names and saying terrible things on the internet is not going to solve anything, that may be true, but it also kind of depends on what you mean by solve anything, right? So if the goal of much of this name calling is not to persuade the person that's being treated badly, but rather to persuade other people who read the exchange, and then that kind of activity is in fact very persuasive to some audiences, what makes it bad argument? And again, to be clear, I incline to think of that as bad argument most of the time. But I think there's more work to be done in your major essay when you're kind of finishing that, thinking through what makes those effective but maybe harmful things bad argument. And as you say, of course, there are always exceptions, and I like your way of trying to think about the exceptions. Even then, I do want to note, this is very much about what you see as right or good, and the fact that it's not always going to be possible. But that doesn't necessarily say what you, as an arguer, would want to do when you encounter the moments where that's not possible. So you take a step back, fine, good. But, what do we do after that step back? What is good argument when we find ourselves arguing with people who, as in this quote from Powell, whose disagreement is in fact rooted in our oppression or rooted in denial of our humanity and right to exist? How do we engage that experience? Is there a possibility of good argument, or does it disappear entirely? And then at the end, you come to the conclusion that there really isn't good or bad argument. And yet, I have to say, it does seem like you have a very strongly felt sense of what is, to you, good argument. And so one of the things that I hope you'll do in the Defining Good Argument in Digital Context essay is really work out for yourself, well, I don't know if you have come to the conclusion that there really isn't good or bad argument. Maybe you have come to that conclusion, but certainly it seems from the way you write about it that you also, in fact, do value some things as like legitimately good. And so one of the things I hope you'll do is work that out a little more fully. Think about what is that for you, and why should other people maybe take on your view? What would be the effects of that? And that sort of starts to get us to this question about impacts and consequences. I'm happy to talk more with you about this in office hours or by appointment. I just want to let you know I appreciated reading this statement of belief, and I'm really looking forward to reading your major essay on defining good argument in digital contexts. All right, thanks.